Hello and welcome. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the noise of the day fall away. Tonight we're descending into a kingdom that no longer exists in any conventional sense. A ruined, echoing world beneath the earth, built by insects who dreamed bigger than insects were ever meant to dream. This is the story of Hallownest. Before we go any further, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Maybe you're curled up under a heavy blanket with the lights already off. Maybe you've got the video playing softly on a nightstand while you stare at the ceiling, waiting for your thoughts to slow down. Maybe you're not even trying to sleep yet, just looking for something quiet to keep you company. Wherever you are, however you got here, you're welcome. There's no correct way to listen to this. If you're out within the first 20 minutes, that's the whole point. If you find yourself still awake 2 hours from now, turning these ideas over in your mind, that's wonderful too. Hollow Knight tells its story in a way that almost nobody else in gaming attempts anymore. There are no cutscenes explaining what happened to this kingdom. There's no narrator walking you through the fall of its royal family. Instead, the story is buried, literally and figuratively, in the architecture of ruined cities, in the fragments of dialogue from dying insects, in item descriptions written like half-remembered prayers, and in the geography itself, which seems to remember its own history even when its inhabitants have forgotten it. Piecing it together is part of the experience, and tonight we're going to do that piecing together for you, slowly, gently. So all you have to do is listen. This is a story about a kingdom of bugs that built cathedrals, about a king who fell in love with something that wasn't quite alive and wasn't quite a god, about plagues of the mind rather than plagues of the body, about children who were never meant to be children, vessels built to hold something too dangerous to exist freely, and the quiet tragedy of a family that tried to solve an impossible problem with an impossible solution. We'll travel from the founding of Hallownest by wandering, wingless bugs with nothing but ambition, through the descent of a radiant god from somewhere beyond the sky, into the desperate architecture of containment the king built around that god's fury, and finally into the long, echoing silence that followed the kingdom's collapse, a silence that a small, nameless knight eventually wanders into, carrying nothing but a nail and a strange emptiness where its heart should be. You don't need to remember every name. You don't need to track every timeline. Let this wash over you the way rain washes over stone, slowly, and without any particular hurry to be understood. Close your eyes if that helps. Let your body sink into whatever you're resting on. Imagine, for a moment, standing at the mouth of a well that seems to have no bottom. Cold air drifts up from somewhere far below, carrying with it a faint, constant sound of dripping water. Somewhere down there, past more darkness than your eyes could ever adjust to, an entire civilization once rose and fell without the surface world ever noticing. Grand Hall stood empty long before anyone up here was born, and they'll likely stand empty long after. That's the world we're stepping into tonight, not with fear, but with the quiet curiosity of someone peering gently into a place that's finished being afraid of itself. And let me tell you about a kingdom built in the dark, and about the little ghost who wandered through its ruins long after everyone else had gone. Chapter 1. The Kingdom of Hallownest. Long before there was a king, before there was a court, before there was even a name for this place, there was only a wilderness of stone beneath the surface of the world, vast caverns stretching down and down, past where sunlight could reach, past where most living things had any reason to go. And into this wilderness came the bugs. They weren't gods, they weren't chosen. They were simply small wandering creatures, some winged, some wingless, most without any particular power beyond persistence, who found their way into the deep dark and decided, for reasons the game never fully explains, to stay. Perhaps they were drawn by curiosity. Perhaps they were fleeing something on the surface we never learn about. Perhaps, like so many civilizations before and after them, they simply followed the promise of resources and shelter down into the depths and kept building until building became a way of life. What these early bugs found in the depths was not empty stone. It was inhabited, sparsely, strangely, by beings that predate almost everything we come to understand about this world. Ancient worm-like creatures moved through the deepest caverns, older than memory, indifferent to the small insects scurrying across their domain. These worms weren't gods exactly, but they weren't ordinary animals either. They represented something primordial, something that existed before civilization had any foothold in this place at all, and their presence in the depths gives the earliest hint that Hallownest was never simply empty ground waiting to be claimed. It was already old. It was already strange. The insects who settled here were building on top of something they didn't fully understand, the way every civilization eventually does. Over time, and we're talking about a span of time so long that the game deliberately refuses to give it firm numbers, these settling bugs began to do something unusual for insects. They began to build with intention, not just burrows and nests, but architecture, halls, bridges, aqueducts, roads carved through solid rock, connecting distant caverns into something that resembled unmistakably a kingdom. This is one of the quietly astonishing details buried in Hollow Knight's world building, the transformation of ordinary insects, creatures whose real-world counterparts build nothing more complex than an anthill or a spiderweb, into master architects, scholars, soldiers, and eventually kings and queens. Something about this particular pocket of the world seemed to accelerate ambition, to grant insects capacities far beyond what their species should possess. Whether this was a natural evolution, or something influenced by forces we'll discuss later in this story, is left deliberately unclear, but the effect is undeniable. Bugs that should have lived brief, simple lives instead built a civilization with the scale and grandeur of any human empire. The kingdom that rose from this ambition would eventually be called Hallownest, though that name, and the figure who gave it that name, belongs to a later chapter of this story. In its earliest form, before Hallownest as we understand it existed, this was simply a growing network of settlements pushing deeper and wider through the underground world, insect tribes and clans slowly encountering one another, sometimes merging, sometimes clashing, sometimes simply existing in parallel without much contact at all. Among the earliest and most significant of these groups were the Mosskin, gentle, moss-covered creatures who lived close to the natural world, tending to groves and greenery in the upper reaches of the caverns. There were also proto-civilizations of what would become the Mantis tribes, fierce and disciplined even in these early days, carving out their own territory through strength and ritual combat. Deep in the western reaches, Spiderkin were already spinning the first threads of what would eventually become the sprawling, webbed metropolis of Deepnest, a civilization we'll spend considerable time exploring later in this story. But it was in the central caverns, the ones that would eventually house the City of Tears, the Forgotten Crossroads, and the Grand Palace at the kingdom's heart, where the most ambitious of these insect settlers gathered. And it was here that the foundations of what would become Hallownest's ruling structure first took shape. The land itself seemed to want to be built upon. Vast natural caverns, opened into cathedral-sized spaces, as though waiting for something grand to fill them. Mineral deposits ran through the stone in veins that could be carved and shaped into building material. Underground lakes and rivers provided water in abundance, eventually feeding into what would become the endless, weeping rains of the City of Tears. Everything about this deep dark world seemed to invite the kind of grand civilization that would eventually rise here, as if the kingdom of Hallownest was not so much built as it was discovered, waiting patiently in the stone for someone ambitious enough to bring it into being. That someone, or something, would arrive in the form of a wandering worm unlike any other, a being who would take the name Worm and eventually become known throughout the kingdom as the Pale King. His arrival marks the true beginning of Hallownest as a unified civilization, and his story, along with the story of the being who would become his queen, is where our tale properly begins. Chapter 2, The Pale King and the White Lady. Among the ancient worms that moved through the deep places of the world before Hallownest existed, there was one who was different from the rest. Where the other worms were content to remain primordial, indifferent, and largely inert, vast, ancient creatures with no particular interest in the small civilizations rising around them, this one worm possessed something the others lacked: curiosity, ambition, and a desire to shape the world rather than simply exist within it. This worm took the name Worm, plainly and directly, as though naming itself after its own nature was the most honest thing it could do. And Worm looked upon the scattered insect settlements, pushing through the deep caverns, and saw not chaos but potential. He saw small, disorganized tribes who might, under the right guidance, become something far greater. He saw the natural cathedrals of stone and thought of palaces. He saw the wandering paths worn by generations of insect feet, and thought of roads connecting a unified kingdom. Worm began to gather the scattered insect peoples under his influence, not through conquest exactly, but through something closer to inspiration and quiet authority. He possessed a kind of natural nobility that drew loyalty rather than demanding it. Under his guidance, the disparate settlements began to organize into something resembling a true civilization, with him at its center. Not quite a god, but something the insects came to regard as close enough to one. It was during this period of consolidation and growth that Worm encountered a being who would change the course of everything that followed, a figure who would come to be known as the White Lady. The White Lady's origins are among the most deliberately obscured details in Hollow Knight's entire lore, and that obscurity feels intentional rather than accidental. She's described in the fragments we're given as being connected to a garden, a vast, ancient, glowing garden of white, luminescent trees that exists in a realm somewhat apart from Hallownest proper, a place of profound beauty and equally profound melancholy. Some interpretations suggest she may be connected to older, more primal forces of nature and growth, a being whose existence predates even the worms in some fundamental sense. She speaks with a wisdom that feels ancient and a sorrow that feels even older. What we know for certain is this: Worm and the White Lady met, and something between them sparked into what can only be described as love. Though love between beings this strange and this powerful takes forms that don't map cleanly onto anything a human observer would recognize. Their union, whatever its true nature, would come to define nearly everything that happened afterward in Hallownest's history, for better and for devastatingly worse. Together, Worm and the White Lady became the founding rulers of Hallownest. Worm took a new title befitting his role as sovereign of this growing kingdom. He became the Pale King, a name reflecting both his pale, luminous form and the quiet, almost ghostly authority he carried. The White Lady became his queen, and under their joint rule, Hallownest transformed from a loose collection of insect tribes into a genuine unified civilization, one that would in time rival any kingdom built by any species anywhere in this world. The Pale King's approach to ruling was distinctive in ways that shaped everything Hallownest would become. He didn't rule through fear or brute conquest. Instead, he offered something the scattered insect tribes had never possessed before: purpose, unity, and, most significantly, a form of consciousness and thought elevated far beyond what ordinary bugs typically possessed. Under his influence, insects who might otherwise have lived brief, instinct-driven lives instead developed complex societies, philosophies, art, and architecture. He effectively gifted his subjects with a form of enlightenment, lifting them out of simple animal existence and into something approaching true civilization. This gift is central to understanding both the Pale King's greatness and his eventual tragedy. He genuinely seemed to want to elevate his kingdom, to build something magnificent and lasting from the raw material of scattered insect tribes. Under his rule, the City of Tears rose from the central caverns, its architecture rivaling anything built on the surface world: towering spires, elegant bridges, and endless gentle rain falling from some source high above that gave the city its name and its perpetual melancholic beauty. The royal waterways were carved beneath it, channeling water throughout the kingdom. The grand palace at the kingdom's heart, where the king and queen would eventually raise their children, was constructed as a monument to everything Hallownest had become. The White Lady, for her part, brought something equally vital to this partnership, though it manifested more quietly than the Pale King's grand architectural and civilizational projects. She brought a connection to growth, to life, to the more organic and nurturing aspects of existence that balance the Pale King's more austere, structural approach to rulership. Where he built cities, she tended to something more delicate: the raising of their children, and eventually a role in Hallownest's fate that would prove just as significant as anything her husband constructed. Hallownest under the Pale King and White Lady entered what can only be described as a golden age. The kingdom expanded, trade flourished between its various districts, distinct insect cultures, the scholarly and industrious bugs of the City of Tears, the reclusive spider kin of Deepnest, the disciplined warrior culture of the Mantis tribes, these strange and ancient inhabitants of Kingdom's Edge, all found their place within this larger unified structure, each contributing something distinct to Hallownest's overall character. It was, by every measure available to us, one of the great civilizations this world had ever seen. But even in this golden age, seeds of tragedy were already being planted. Because the Pale King's ambition, the very quality that had allowed him to build this magnificent kingdom in the first place, would eventually lead him toward a project so dangerous, so fraught with impossible costs, that it would ultimately unmake everything he and the White Lady had built together. That project began with an encounter with something older and far more dangerous than either of them, a being of pure, radiant light that had existed in this world long before the Pale King ever arrived, and whose presence would come to define the entire second half of Hallownest's story. Chapter 3: The Radiance. To understand the tragedy that eventually consumed Hallownest, we need to go back even further than the Pale King's arrival, back to a time before worms, before insects built kingdoms in the dark, to an age when this world was illuminated not by the Pale King's quiet luminescence, but by something far more overwhelming, a god of light and dreams known as the Radiance. The Radiance was, in the earliest age of this world, worshipped by the insects who lived here, not the ancestors of Hallownest's later civilization specifically, but an older culture entirely, one that predates almost everything we've discussed so far. This was a civilization of moths, drawn to and devoted to the Radiance in the way moths are drawn to any bright, consuming light. They built their entire way of life around her, a religion, a culture, an entire cosmology centered on this radiant, blinding deity who watched over them from somewhere beyond ordinary comprehension. The Radiance, as she's understood through the fragments of lore scattered across Hollow Knight's world, functioned as something closer to a primal force than a conventional deity. She represented light itself, and more specifically, she represented the realm of dreams, the strange, half-real dimension that exists parallel to Hallownest's physical world, accessible through dream-based abilities that certain characters, including eventually the player character, come to wield. In this early age, before the worms rose to prominence, the Radiance's dominion over dreams and light made her effectively supreme among the divine forces of this world. But dominance in the mythology Hollow Knight constructs is never permanent. The worms, ancient primordial beings who existed in a different capacity than the Radiance, more tied to the physical substance of the world itself, eventually rose in influence, and with their rise came a fundamental challenge to the old order the Radiance had presided over. The details of exactly how this transition happened are among the murkiest parts of Hollow Knight's lore, communicated mostly through cryptic item descriptions and the ravings of characters driven mad by contact with the Radiance's influence. But the broad strokes are clear enough. The worms supplanted the old gods, the Radiance included, and a new age began, one no longer centered on her light, but on the worms' quieter, more physical dominion. The Radiance did not simply vanish when this transition occurred. She was pushed out, suppressed, sealed away, though sealed away doesn't quite capture the strangeness of what actually happened to her. She persisted, diminished, in a state of dormancy, no longer actively worshipped, no longer actively present in the waking world, but not destroyed either. She lingered in the substrate of dreams themselves, waiting, the way old gods in mythologies across countless cultures tend to wait, patient, resentful, and biding time for circumstances to shift back in their favour. The moths who had once worshipped her found themselves in a strange position after her fall from prominence. Some among them continued their devotion in secret, unable or unwilling to abandon the faith that had structured their entire civilization. This devotion would persist for an extraordinarily long time, passed down through generations of mothkin who kept the old religion alive even as the wider world moved on, even as Hallownest rose and eventually the moths themselves became a marginalized, largely forgotten people within the Pale King's new order. This dormancy, however, was never going to be truly permanent. The Radiance, diminished, but not destroyed, existed in a state that Hollow Knight's narrative treats almost like pressure building behind a dam, quiet for a long time, but never actually gone, and never actually reconciled to her displacement. She waited in the substrate of dreams and memory, watching as the worms built their civilizations, watching as the Pale King in particular rose to prominence and constructed his glittering kingdom directly above the very ground where her old worshippers had once knelt in devotion to her. And this proximity, Hallownest rising quite literally on top of the buried remnants of the Radiance's old religion, would prove catastrophic, because dormant gods, in stories like this one, rarely stay dormant when their old worshippers remain nearby, still carrying fragments of devotion in their hearts, even generations after the official religion has been supplanted. The Radiance's influence began, slowly and almost imperceptibly at first, to seep back into the world through exactly this channel, the lingering faith of the mothkin who had never fully abandoned her. It's worth dwelling for a moment on what made this particular threat so uniquely difficult to counter, because it differs fundamentally from any conventional danger a kingdom might prepare against. An invading army can be met with soldiers, A natural disaster can be mitigated with engineering and preparation. But a god who spreads through shared dreams, through inherited devotion passed quietly down across generations, through the simple fact that some corner of a population never fully let go of an old faith, that kind of threat has no clear front line, no fortress wall capable of holding it back. It moves through minds rather than territory, and minds, unlike borders, cannot be easily patrolled or sealed. The Moth civilization itself, meanwhile, persisted throughout this entire period in a state of quiet, diminished existence, no longer the proud central culture they had once been under the Radiance's undisputed rule, but a marginalized people scattered at the edges of the Pale King's kingdom, tolerated more than embraced, their old temples and shrines left to crumble even as fragments of their devotion continued, almost involuntarily, to keep their old goddess tethered to the waking world. There's a particular sorrow in this detail. The moths themselves likely never intended to endanger Hallownest. They simply couldn't fully let go of what their ancestors had believed, and that quiet inherited loyalty became, without any of them quite realizing it, the very thread the Radiance used to pull herself back toward relevance. This slow, creeping return of the Radiance's influence is what the Pale King would eventually come to recognize as an existential threat to everything he had built. Not an invading army, not a natural disaster, but something far more insidious. A kind of infection of the mind, spreading gradually through a population that still, on some subconscious level, remembered and yearned for their old god. The Pale King, perceptive and intelligent in ways that had allowed him to build Hallownest in the first place, recognized the danger of the Radiance's dormant presence long before it became an active crisis. He understood, with the kind of clarity that comes from genuine wisdom, that a god who had once commanded absolute devotion does not simply disappear because a new order has been established. She was still there, waiting, and her return, should it ever fully occur, would mean nothing less than the destruction of everything Hallownest represented, a complete unmaking of the civilization he and the White Lady had spent so long building. It was this recognition, this genuine and well-founded fear, that drove the Pale King toward the most consequential decision of his entire reign. A decision involving his own children, a substance called the Void, and a plan so audacious and so fraught with moral horror that it would ultimately doom the very kingdom it was meant to protect. Chapter 4: The Vessels. Facing the slow, creeping threat of the Radiance's eventual return, the Pale King needed a solution, and not a temporary one. He needed something capable of permanently containing a being of near limitless power and near limitless patience, something that could hold the Radiance in check not just for years or decades, but indefinitely, for as long as Hallownest itself might exist. His solution came from an unlikely and deeply unsettling source: the Abyss. The Abyss, which we'll explore in far greater depth later in this story, is one of the strangest and most conceptually dense locations in all of Hollow Knight's world. A vast black void existing at the very bottom of the kingdom, beneath even the deepest reaches most inhabitants ever travelled. The Abyss is associated with a substance called the Void, a kind of pure primordial emptiness given physical, almost liquid form. The Void is often interpreted as representing the absence of thought, the absence of individual will, a kind of oblivion that exists in direct opposition to everything the Radiance represents. Where the Radiance is light, consciousness, dreams, an overwhelming individual presence, the Void is darkness, blankness, and the complete absence of self. This oppositional relationship is precisely what made the void so appealing to the Pale King as he searched for a way to contain the Radiance. If the Radiance represented an overwhelming, invasive form of consciousness, one that could infect minds and spread through dreams, then perhaps something built from pure void, something fundamentally empty and without the capacity for individual thought or dream, could serve as a vessel resistant to her influence. A container with nothing inside it for the Radiance to invade, nothing for her light to catch hold of and spread through. The Pale King ventured into the abyss, and through means the game leaves deliberately vague but which clearly involved profound sacrifice and risk, gathered creatures born from the void itself, small, shade-like beings native to that endless black emptiness. These void creatures would become the basis for his solution. He would shape them, elevate them, and attempt to craft from them a vessel powerful enough and empty enough to contain the Radiance permanently. This is where the White Lady's role in this story becomes essential and deeply poignant. The Pale King needed more than raw void material to create a viable vessel. He needed something to give that void material stability, structure, a physical form capable of surviving in the world and growing over time. The White Lady provided this. Through her own nature, connected, as we discussed, to growth and to the more organic, nurturing aspects of existence. She gave form and life to what would otherwise have remained formless shadow. Together, the Pale King and White Lady created not one vessel, but many, their own children, in the truest sense, born from this union of void emptiness and the White Lady's life-giving nature. These children, the vessels, were meant to be perfect containers, physically capable of holding the Radiance's overwhelming power, but internally hollow, without will, without independent thought, without the capacity to dream in any meaningful sense. A being with nothing inside it cannot be infected by something that spreads through minds and dreams. That was the theory, at least, and it's a theory built on a foundation of profound and troubling logic. The idea that the only way to protect a kingdom from a god of consciousness was to raise children deliberately emptied of consciousness themselves. Many vessels were created during this period, though not all of them succeeded in achieving the perfect hollowness the Pale King required. Some retained fragments of will, fragments of emotion, fragments of individual identity that made them unsuitable for the role of container. These imperfect vessels were, in the cold logic of the Pale King's project, considered failures, though failure, in this context, meant something far more tragic than the word usually implies. These failed vessels were not simply discarded in any humane sense. Many were sealed away, hidden in the depths of the kingdom, effectively imprisoned for the crime of possessing too much personality, too much inner life, to serve their intended purpose. We'll spend more time with some of these failed vessels later in our story, figures like the broken vessel and the lost kin, whose stories carry a particular weight precisely because they represent children who were, in a sense, rejected by their own father for the sin of being too alive, too present, too much themselves. But among all the vessels created during this period, one stood apart. One achieved something close to the perfect emptiness the Pale King sought, a vessel so thoroughly hollow, so completely without independent will or dream, that it seemed to fulfill every requirement of the project. This vessel would come to be known, appropriately and devastatingly, as the Hollow Knight. The selection of this particular vessel as the chosen container wasn't simply a matter of finding the emptiest candidate, though emptiness was certainly the primary criterion. There's a specific and quietly heartbreaking detail buried in the lore here. Physical size and strength mattered too, because the vessel needed to be capable of physically containing and eventually battling the Radiance when the time came. And so the Pale King selected not just the most hollow of his children, but specifically one of the larger, more physically robust among them, elevating this one child above all its siblings, including a sibling who would come to play a crucial role in our story much later. A smaller vessel, initially considered too weak or too small for the role, who was set aside, allowed to grow up in circumstances far removed from the crushing responsibility placed on the chosen Hollow Knight. This smaller, set-aside vessel is, of course, the character you actually play as throughout Hollow Knight, though we won't reveal the full significance of that connection until later in our story, when the threads of Vessel, Kingdom and Radiance finally converge. For now though, our story follows the Vessel who was chosen, the one raised, trained and ultimately prepared from birth for a singular crushing purpose. Let's turn now to the story of the Hollow Knight itself, the sibling who bore the full weight of the Pale King's desperate plan. Chapter 5, The Hollow Knight. The vessel selected to carry the Pale King's plan was raised for a single, all-consuming purpose from what could barely even be called childhood. There was no room in this vessel's upbringing for anything resembling a normal life, no space for play or discovery, or the small formative experiences that shape most beings, insect or otherwise. Every moment of this vessel's existence was oriented toward a singular future event, the moment it would need to contain, permanently and completely, a god of light and dreams within its own hollow form, the Hollow Knight, as this vessel would eventually be known throughout Hallownest, its title becoming its name in the way titles often do for figures whose individual identity has been deliberately erased, trained and grew under the Pale King's direct guidance. It was raised in isolation, largely apart from the wider kingdom, its existence known to relatively few beyond the highest levels of Hallownest's royal court. This isolation wasn't cruelty for its own sake, or at least it wasn't intended as such. It was, in the Pale King's calculation, a necessary precaution. A vessel meant to be the perfect empty container couldn't be allowed to form the kinds of attachments, memories, and relationships that might compromise its hollowness. Isolation was, in the king's cold logic, a kind of protection, protecting the vessel's purity, and by extension, protecting the entire kingdom's future. As the Hollow Knight grew, it seemed, by every measure the Pale King could observe, to be exactly what was needed. It showed no outward signs of independent will. It expressed no fear, no desire, no resistance to the fate being prepared for it. Whether this apparent perfection reflected a genuine and complete absence of inner life, or whether it reflected a will so completely suppressed and disciplined that it simply never manifested outwardly, is one of the questions Hollow Knight's narrative leaves deliberately, achingly unresolved. We're never entirely certain whether the Hollow Knight was truly empty inside, or whether it was simply the most successful at hiding whatever remained. When the time finally came, and the game is vague about exactly how long this preparation took, though the implication is that it spanned what would be, for an ordinary insect, several lifetimes. The Pale King led his chosen vessel into direct confrontation with the Radiance. The details of this confrontation are among the most mythologized and least concretely explained moments in Hollow Knight's entire narrative, which feels appropriate given the almost sacred weight the kingdom's later inhabitants would place on it. What we understand is this: the Radiance, whose influence had continued growing through the persistent devotion of the Moth-kin who had never fully abandoned her worship, was drawn into direct contact with the Hollow Knight, and in that confrontation, The vessel did exactly what it had been created to do. It contained her. It sealed her away, pulling her essence into its own hollow form, trapping a god of light and dreams inside a vessel deliberately built to hold nothing at all. This victory, if we can even call it a victory, given everything it would eventually cost, became the foundation of a new age of stability for Hallownest. The Radiance was gone from the waking world, sealed inside the hollow night, and the Pale King's kingdom could continue its golden age without the looming threat that had shadowed his entire reign. To commemorate and reinforce this containment, the Pale King had a massive structure built directly above the location where the sealing occurred, a location we know as the Black Egg Temple, an imposing sealed chamber that would come to represent both the kingdom's salvation and eventually its tomb. For a time, again, an unspecified but clearly substantial time, this containment held. The Hollow Night remained sealed within the Black Egg Temple, silently, endlessly bearing the weight of a god's fury within its own hollow form. Hallownest flourished around this quiet sacrifice, its citizens largely unaware of the true nature of what was holding their kingdom's ancient threat at bay, or unaware, at least, of the full cost involved. But here is where the tragedy of the Pale King's plan reveals its deepest flaw, the crack in the foundation that would eventually bring the entire structure down. The vessel was never quite as perfectly hollow as the plan required. Somewhere within the Hollow Night, despite everything, despite the isolation, the training, the deliberate suppression of anything resembling individual will, some small fragment of imperfection remained, and through that fragment, however small, the Radiance found purchase. She began to corrupt her container from within, slowly, patiently, the way she had once slowly corrupted the loyalty of Mothkin generations earlier. This corruption would eventually manifest as what the kingdom came to call the infection, a plague not of the body but of the mind, spreading outward from the Black Egg Temple through channels we'll explore in detail shortly. The very solution the Pale King had devised to save his kingdom from the Radiance would become the mechanism of that kingdom's downfall, because no vessel, however carefully raised and however thoroughly emptied, could ever be perfectly, permanently hollow. There was always, in the end, some small crack, and gods, it turns out, are extraordinarily patient about finding cracks. Before we follow that infection spread, though, we need to turn our attention to the Hollow Knight's siblings, the other vessels created during the Pale King's project, some raised alongside their chosen sibling, others discarded, hidden, or simply forgotten in the depth of the kingdom their family had built. Chapter 6. The Pale King's Other Children. The Hollow Knight was not the Pale King's only child, and understanding the fates of its siblings adds a layer of quiet devastation to this story that goes beyond even the tragedy of the chosen vessel itself. As we discussed, the process of creating a viable vessel from void material was not a precise science. The Pale King and White Ladies Union produced many vessels over the course of this project, and not all of them achieved the hollowness required for the role of container. These imperfect vessels, retaining fragments of will, emotion, or independent thought that disqualified them from the primary purpose, met varied and often tragic fates. Among the most significant of these failed vessels is the being known as the Broken Vessel, sometimes referred to in the game's imagery and design as the Lost Kin, depending on which stage of its story you encounter. This vessel, unlike the Hollow Knight, was ultimately deemed unsuitable for containing the Radiance, whether because it retained too much independent will, or for reasons the game never fully clarifies. Rather than being elevated to the role of chosen container, this sibling was instead sealed away and largely forgotten, hidden in the depths of the kingdom in a location that would later become associated with the infection's spread. The broken vessel's story becomes particularly tragic when we consider what eventually happens to it. Isolated, forgotten, essentially abandoned by the very family that created it, this vessel eventually becomes infected itself, corrupted by the same plague that would eventually spread from its siblings' containment failure. When players encounter the broken vessel deep within the flooded, ruined lower depths of the kingdom, what they're witnessing is a discarded child, twisted and consumed by the very sickness its more successful sibling was originally created to prevent. There's a particular cruelty in this detail. The vessel that failed to be hollow enough for its father's purposes ends up succumbing to infection anyway, receiving no protection for having been set aside, only abandonment. Other vessels met other fates, glimpsed only in fragments throughout the game's world, remains found in forgotten chambers, husks left in places that suggest failed experiments or discarded prototypes in the Pale King's larger project. The overall picture that emerges is one of a father who created numerous children specifically to serve a singular purpose, and who showed little apparent concern for those children's well-being once they were determined unsuitable for that purpose. This isn't necessarily portrayed as active cruelty on the Pale King's part. There's no indication he took pleasure in discarding imperfect vessels, but it reflects a coldness, a willingness to sacrifice individual well-being for the sake of the larger kingdom that runs through everything the Pale King does in this story. And then there is the smallest vessel, the one initially considered too weak, too underdeveloped to be a viable candidate for the role given to the Hollow Knight. This vessel, small, seemingly unremarkable among its more physically robust siblings, was essentially set aside from the main project. Rather than being elevated to bear the crushing responsibility given to the chosen Hollow Knight, or being sealed away like the broken vessel, this smallest sibling was, in a sense, allowed to simply exist, largely outside the kingdom's central concerns. This smaller vessel would eventually leave Hallownest, or perhaps was sent away, the details remain characteristically ambiguous, ending up far from the kingdom of its birth, growing up in circumstances entirely disconnected from the weight of destiny placed on its larger sibling. And it is this vessel, this seemingly unremarkable, set-aside child, who would eventually return to Hallownest years later, wandering into the ruins of the kingdom with no memory of its origins, carrying only a nail and an empty shell where a heart should be. This returning vessel is, of course, the character player's guide throughout Hollow Knight, the Knight, as the game refers to this figure, though the title carries the same kind of quiet irony as the Hollow Knight's own name. Both siblings, in their own ways, are defined by absence, one by the deliberate, engineered hollowness that made it suitable to contain a god, the other by the accidental hollowness of simply being overlooked, set aside and eventually forgotten by a family that had bigger concerns. It's worth pausing on just how strange this family dynamic really is when we lay it out plainly. Here is a father who created dozens, perhaps hundreds, of children through the same essential process, and who then sorted them by usefulness, one elevated to bear the weight of an entire kingdom's survival, others discarded for retaining too much personality, and one simply overlooked because it didn't seem strong enough to matter. There's no cruelty in the traditional dramatic sense here. The Pale King never appears to relish any of this. But there's a colder, more institutional kind of cruelty at work, the kind that emerges when a ruler starts treating even his own children as components in a larger engineering problem. Every vessel we encounter throughout Hallownest's ruins, whether fully realised like the Hollow Knight, corrupted and forgotten like the broken vessel, or quietly wandering and unaware like the night itself, carries some version of this same original wound. A birth defined entirely by someone else's need, rather than by any inherent value the vessel might have held simply for existing. We'll return to the smaller vessel's journey in much greater detail later in our story, once we've fully explored what happened to Hallownest in the years its siblings were separated. Because in the time between the Hollow Knight's containment of the Radiance and the smaller vessel's eventual return to the kingdom, everything the Pale King and White Lady had built would collapse, slowly and then all at once, under the weight of the very plague their containment plan was meant to prevent. Chapter 7. The infection spreads. For a period of unspecified but clearly substantial length, Hallownest thrived under the belief that the Radiance had been permanently dealt with. The Hollow Knight remained sealed within the Black Egg Temple, silently bearing its burden, and the kingdom around it continued to grow, to build, to flourish in ways that suggested the Pale King's grand project had genuinely succeeded. But the crack in that containment, the small, unavoidable imperfection in even the most carefully raised vessel, never fully closed. And through it, slowly, patiently, the Radiance began to reassert her influence on the world, not through any dramatic escape, but through something far more insidious. Infiltration through dreams. This is where we need to understand a crucial mechanical and thematic element of Hollow Knight's cosmology: the deep, persistent connection between the Radiance and the realm of dreams. Even sealed away, even trapped within the Hollow Knight's hollow form, the Radiance retained some connection to the dream world, the same dream world that certain gifted insects throughout Hallownest's history had learned to access and traverse. And it was through this connection, this shared dream space, that her corrupting influence began to seep back out into the waking world, infecting the minds of Hallownest's citizens one by one. The infection, as it came to be known throughout the kingdom, didn't manifest as a physical illness in any conventional sense. It manifested as a kind of madness, an overwhelming compulsion that gradually stripped away rational thought and replaced it with something closer to fanatical, orange-eyed devotion. Devotion ultimately to the Radiance herself, whose light and influence the infected began unconsciously serving, even as they had no conscious awareness of what was happening to them. The progression of the infection followed a horrifyingly familiar pattern for anyone who has heard stories of plagues throughout human history, translated here into an insect kingdom and given a cosmic, quasi-religious dimension. It began subtly. Citizens would show small changes in behaviour, increased aggression, unusual fixations, glowing orange eyes that hadn't been there before. These early symptoms were often dismissed, explained away, or simply not connected to any larger pattern by a kingdom that had, after all, believed its greatest cosmic threat to be permanently neutralized. But the symptoms progressed. The infected became increasingly erratic, increasingly consumed by whatever compulsion the Radiance's influence instilled in them, until eventually they lost themselves entirely, becoming what the kingdom's remaining inhabitants would come to call simply the infected, mindless, aggressive husks, driven by a will no longer their own. The spread accelerated as more and more of the kingdom's population succumbed. What had begun as isolated, easily dismissed cases grew into something approaching a kingdom-wide epidemic. Entire districts of Hallownest began to empty of anyone capable of coherent thought, replaced by orange-eyed, aggressive shells of the citizens who once lived there. The City of Tears, once the crown jewel of the Pale King civilization, became increasingly abandoned as its population either succumbed to infection or fled to whatever safety could still be found. The Pale King, watching his kingdom collapse under a plague he thought he had already permanently prevented, faced the horrifying realization that his entire solution had been built on a flaw he either failed to anticipate or failed to adequately address. The vessel he had created specifically to prevent this exact catastrophe was, in fact, the very source of it, not through any failure of strength or containment in the physical sense, but through a crack in its hollowness so small it had gone undetected for what may have been generations. Different factions and individuals throughout the kingdom responded to the growing crisis in different ways, and their varied responses give us some of the most poignant character stories scattered throughout Hollow Knight's world. Some, like the great nail sage Sly, sought increasingly desperate and violent means of combating infected enemies, honing themselves into weapons against the plague even as it consumed everyone around them. Others, like the Mantis tribes in their isolated territories, largely managed to wall themselves off from the worst of the infection spread through sheer discipline and isolation. Still others, particularly among the more independently minded citizens of the kingdom, simply fled, abandoning Hallownest entirely rather than face a plague that seemed to have no cure and no clear point of origin that anyone outside the royal family understood. The White Lady, for her part, appears to have recognised the severity of the crisis earlier and more clearly than her husband, or at least reacted to it with a different kind of urgency. Sensing that the kingdom her husband had built and the containment plan they had built together were both failing beyond any hope of repair, she began quietly making arrangements that would eventually connect to the smaller, set-aside vessel we discussed earlier, and to a hidden sanctuary deep in the kingdom's most secret depths, a place we'll explore fully in a later chapter. As the infection continued its relentless spread, consuming more and more of the kingdom's population and territory, the Pale King made a final, desperate decision, one that would come to define the very landscape players explore throughout Hollow Knight. Rather than watch his kingdom be slowly consumed by madness, rather than let the infection spread indefinitely and potentially beyond Hallownest's borders entirely, he made the choice to seal the kingdom itself. Using a combination of the kingdom's remaining magical and structural resources, the Pale King orchestrated what would come to be known as the Kingdom's Sealing, an act that effectively cut Hallownest off from the world above, trapping the infection and everyone still living within the kingdom's boundaries inside a closed system with no possibility of escape or outside intervention. It was, in its own way, an echo of the very containment logic that had created the vessels in the first place. If something dangerous cannot be destroyed, seal it away completely, whatever the cost to those trapped inside with it. This sealing marks the true end of Hallownest's golden age and the beginning of the silence that players would eventually wander into centuries or perhaps longer after these events, in the game's actual present-day setting. The kingdom the Pale King and White Lady had built together, the civilization that had risen from scattered insect tribes into one of the great kingdoms of this world, was reduced to a sealed tomb, its remaining inhabitants left to face the infection spread with no hope of rescue, no hope of cure, and increasingly no hope at all. Chapter 8. Deepnest and the Weavers. While the central kingdom built by the Pale King represents the primary narrative thread of Hollow Knight's lore, it's far from the only significant civilization that existed within Hallownest's broader territory. To the west, in a sprawling claustrophobic network of tunnels and webbed chambers, existed one of the kingdom's oldest and most insular societies, the Spiderkin civilization of Deepnest. Deepnest predates much of the Pale King's central kingdom in its origins, tracing back to some of the earliest insect settlers who found their way into this underground world. The Spiderkin who founded and populated Deepnest developed along a distinctly different trajectory than the citizens of the City of Tears and the surrounding central territories. Where the Pale King's civilization embraced open architecture, grand cathedrals and elevated philosophical and artistic pursuits, Deepness developed as something far more insular, practical and, to outsiders at least, unsettling. Its tunnels are narrow, webbed, claustrophobic, designed for creatures who move differently than the walking, winged insects of the Central Kingdom. The ruling force of Deepnest, insofar as the fractured semi-hostile Spiderkin society had anything resembling unified rule, centred on figures known as the Weavers, an ancient tribe of Spiderkin possessing significant power and influence, credited in the kingdom's oldest legends and songs with weaving the very fabric of the world itself in some allegorical or perhaps literal sense. The Weavers represent one of Hollow Knight's more mythologically dense elements, blending practical Spiderkin society with almost creation myth levels of cosmic significance. Deepness' relationship with the central Hallownest kingdom was never particularly warm, even during the height of the Pale King's rule. The Spiderkin largely kept to themselves, maintaining their own customs, their own hierarchy, and a generally wary if not outright hostile stance toward outsiders who ventured into their territory uninvited. This insularity meant that Deepnest, unlike the more centrally integrated districts of Hallownest, retained a distinct cultural identity throughout the kingdom's history, one that never fully merged into the broader civilization the Pale King was building. This separateness would prove, in a strange way, to be one of Deepness' few advantages when the infection eventually began its spread. While the more centrally located and densely populated districts of Hallownest suffered catastrophic losses to the plague, Deepness' isolation, the same insularity that had always set it apart from the rest of the kingdom, provided some measure of natural protection. This isn't to say Deepness escaped the infection's reach entirely. Evidence throughout the game suggests infected creatures did eventually penetrate even these deep, webbed tunnels. But the Spiderkin's separate society, existing largely outside the main channels through which the infection spread, meant that Deepness' collapse, when it eventually came, followed a different pattern and a different timeline than the fall of the Central Kingdom. One of the most tragic and compelling figures connected to Deepness' story is Hera the Beast, ruler of the Spiderkin and one of the most significant political figures in Hallownest's history, outside the Pale King's own family. Hera commanded respect and eventually a kind of uneasy alliance with the Pale King's central government, an alliance significant enough that Hera is counted among a small group of powerful rulers who contributed something crucial to the kingdom's later, more desperate plans, which we'll discuss when we reach the story of the knight's own journey. Hera's story connects directly to one of Hollow Knight's most beloved and significant characters, Hornet, Hera's daughter, born from a union between the Spiderkin ruler and the Pale King himself. This connection, a child born from an alliance, however uneasy, between the Central Kingdom and Deepnest's separate society, makes Hornet a genuinely unique figure in Hallownest's story. Neither fully a vessel like the Hollow Knight, and the smaller vessel will follow throughout our main narrative, nor fully removed from the royal bloodline that shapes so much of this kingdom's fate. She occupies a space between worlds, belonging fully to neither the sealed Central Kingdom nor the insular Spiderkin civilization of her mother, and this dual nature would come to define her role throughout the events players eventually witness. There's a particular quality to Deepness that sets it apart even in a kingdom already defined by shadow and ruin. Where the City of Tears carries the melancholic grandeur of a fallen capital, and Kingdom's Edge carries the harshness of a frontier beaten down by extremity, Deepness carries something closer to dread, a sense that this was never meant to be wandered by outsiders at all, that its narrow webbed passages were built for a kind of privacy the rest of the kingdom never valued in the same way. Even the Weavers, whose techniques the Spiderkin still passed down long after the Pale King's reign began, seem to have understood their home not as a district of a larger kingdom, but as a world unto itself, folded quietly into Hallownest's western edge, and largely content to remain unseen. Deepness' ultimate fate, like so much of Hallownest, is one of quiet, lingering decay rather than sudden collapse. By the time players eventually wander into its tunnels, the civilization the Weavers once presided over has largely crumbled into ruin, its remaining inhabitants scattered, hostile, or simply gone. What remains is a haunting labyrinth of empty webs and abandoned chambers, a testament to a society that chose isolation over integration, and which paid its own particular price for that choice when the kingdom around it finally fell. Chapter 9: The Mantis Lords and Kingdom's Edge. Moving from the western reaches of Deepness toward the far edges of Hallownest territory, we encounter another distinct culture that existed within the kingdom's broader borders while maintaining its own fierce independence: the Mantis tribes, and the harsh, ancient landscape they called home at Kingdom's Edge. The Mantis culture that developed within Hallownest territory represents one of the most disciplined and militarily focused societies in the game's entire world. From the earliest days of insect settlement in these underground caverns, the Mantis kin distinguished themselves through martial prowess and rigid, honor-bound social structures. Their society was built around combat not merely as a practical necessity, but as a central cultural and even spiritual practice. Ritual combat served as a means of establishing hierarchy, resolving disputes, and demonstrating worthiness within their tightly structured tribal system. The Mantis tribes were governed by figures known as the Mantis Lords, a triumvirate of powerful warrior rulers whose authority combined political leadership with an almost religious reverence for combat and discipline. Unlike the sprawling, architecturally ambitious civilization the Pale King built at Hallownest's centre, the Mantis tribes maintained a more austere, function-focused society, one that prized strength, honour, and tradition above the grand artistic and philosophical pursuits that defined the Central Kingdom. Despite existing within Hallownest's broader territorial boundaries, the Mantis tribes maintained a fierce independence throughout much of the kingdom's history, resistant to full integration into the Pale King's central authority. This independence wasn't necessarily hostile. The game suggests a relationship of mutual respect, or at least mutual tolerance, existed between the Mantis kin and the Central Kingdom for much of their shared history. But it meant that Mantis territory operated by its own rules, governed by its own rulers, following its own traditions rather than simply deferring to the authority radiating outward from the City of Tears. This same disciplined independence would prove crucial when the infection began its catastrophic spread throughout the kingdom. Much like Deepness isolation provided some natural protection against the plague's reach, the Mantis tribe's rigid, insular society and their remote territory at Kingdom's Edge allowed them to maintain a degree of stability that much of the rest of Hallownest simply couldn't achieve. Evidence throughout the game suggests the Mantis Lords and their people managed to largely wall themselves off from the worst ravages of the infection, maintaining their traditions and their territory even as the Central Kingdom collapsed into chaos around them. This isn't to suggest the Mantis tribes emerged from Hallownest's collapse unscathed. By the time players encounter their territory, the once thriving Mantis civilization has clearly diminished significantly. Its numbers reduced, its former grandeur faded into something more like a proud but shrinking remnant of what it once was. The Mantis Lords themselves, when finally encountered, represent both the pinnacle of their culture's martial tradition and, in a sense, the last significant vestige of that tradition's former glory. Powerful, disciplined warriors presiding over a diminished kingdom within a kingdom, still bound by honour and ritual, even as the wider world around them has largely fallen into ruin. Beyond the Mantis tribe's own territory lies Kingdom's Edge itself, one of the harshest, most inhospitable environments within Hallownest's borders, a jagged volcanic landscape at the very periphery of the kingdom's reach. Kingdom's Edge represents something distinct from the more cultivated, civilized regions closer to the kingdom's centre. It's a place shaped by extremity, extreme heat in some sections, extreme cold in others, and inhabited by creatures who have adapted to survive in conditions far harsher than anything found in the City of Tears, or even in Deepness' claustrophobic tunnels. This liminal, edge-of-the-map territory is home to some of Hollow Knight's most enigmatic figures and locations, including the Hive, a distinct, honey-producing civilization of bee-like creatures who, much like the Mantis tribes and the Spiderkin of Deepness, maintain their own separate culture, largely apart from the Central Kingdom's direct governance. The Hive story is one of relative isolation, and ultimately its own quiet tragedy. As the once thriving colony dwindles by the time players encounter it, its numbers reduce to a lonely, grief-stricken remnant tending to a hive that has lost most of what once made it vibrant. Kingdom's Edge also connects, both geographically and thematically, to some of the game's most direct explorations of the infection's ultimate consequences, including tragic transformations of characters whose fates underscore just how thoroughly the plague reshaped even the kingdom's harshest, most remote corners, proving that no territory, however isolated or however disciplined its people, could remain entirely untouched by what had been unleashed at the kingdom's heart. What unites the stories of Deepness, the Mantis tribes, and the harsh territories of Kingdom's Edge is this common thread. Each represents a distinct culture existing at Hallownest's margins, maintaining its own identity and its own traditions even while nominally existing within the Pale King's broader kingdom. Each, in its own way, weathered the kingdom's ultimate collapse differently than the Central Territories did, offering us a more complete, more textured picture of Hallownest not as a single monolithic civilization, but as a genuine patchwork of distinct insect cultures, each with its own history, its own values, and its own particular relationship to the catastrophe that eventually consumed them all. Chapter 10. The Abyss and the Void. Now we return to a concept we touched on earlier but haven't yet fully explored: the Abyss and the strange primordial substance known as the void that flows through it, a concept that sits at the very philosophical and cosmological heart of everything Hollow Knight has to say about consciousness, identity, and what it truly means to be hollow. The Abyss exists at the absolute bottom of Hallownest's vast underground territory, beneath even the deepest reaches most of the kingdom's inhabitants ever travelled or even knew existed. It represents, in the game's careful visual and thematic language, something close to a primordial state of existence, a place of near total darkness, populated by countless small shadowy creatures born directly from the void substance that fills this space. The void, as a concept within Hollow Knight's mythology, functions as something like the philosophical opposite of everything the Radiance represents. Where the Radiance embodies light, individual consciousness, dreams, and an overwhelming, almost aggressive presence that seeks to spread and dominate, the void embodies darkness, the absence of individual will, and a kind of collective, undifferentiated existence that stands in direct opposition to everything the Radiance's nature represents. If the Radiance is an excess of self, the void is an absence of self entirely. Not evil in any conventional sense, but genuinely fundamentally empty. This oppositional relationship between void and Radiance is precisely what made the Abyss so significant to the Pale King's containment project, as we discussed in an earlier chapter. He recognized that a vessel built from void material, something inherently resistant to the kind of individual consciousness and dream-based influence the Radiance relied on to spread, represented his best chance at creating a container capable of holding a god of light indefinitely. But the Abyss represents more than simply a resource the Pale King mined for his containment project. It carries its own deep, unsettling history within Hallownest's broader mythology, connected to some of the game's oldest and most obscured lore. Ancient legends scattered throughout the game's world suggest the Abyss and its void-born creatures existed long before the Pale King's arrival, predating even the earliest insect settlements in these underground caverns. Some interpretations connect the Void's origins to an even more ancient cosmic event, the fall or destruction of some prior god or cosmic order, with the Void representing the shattered, formless remnant of whatever existed before. This connects to one of the more haunting details buried in the game's lore, the suggestion that the Void isn't merely raw, inert material waiting to be shaped by beings like the Pale King, but something closer to a suppressed, collective consciousness of its own. Countless small wills, perhaps the remnants of countless small deaths or endings, compressed together into something that reads as empty from the outside, but which may, in its own strange way, possess a kind of unified, patient awareness beneath that apparent emptiness. This ambiguity becomes crucial when we consider the fates of the vessels created from this material, the Hollow Knight, the Broken Vessel, and eventually the smaller vessel player's guide throughout the game's main story. If the void these vessels were built from isn't truly empty, but rather a kind of compressed, patient collective consciousness, then the entire premise of the Pale King's containment project becomes even more tragic and even more philosophically fraught than it initially appears. His children weren't simply empty containers, blank slates with nothing inside them to protect from the Radiance's influence. They may have carried, buried deep within their supposedly hollow forms, something of the Void's own strange collective nature, something that isn't quite individual will, but isn't quite nothing either. This ambiguity plays out most directly in the relationship between the smaller vessel, the game's actual player character, and a mysterious artifact and transformation connected to the deepest reaches of the Abyss, available to those who pursue certain paths through the game's late-game content. Through connection to the void that fills that endless black space, the smaller vessel can achieve a kind of communion with this primordial substance that goes beyond simple containment, suggesting a relationship between vessel and void far more intimate and far more significant than the Pale King's original utilitarian purpose ever intended. The Abyss also serves as the location of one of Hollow Knight's most quietly devastating story threads, the fate of countless discarded vessels, the failed experiments and imperfect containers created during the Pale King's long process of trying to craft a vessel hollow enough for his purposes. Many of these failed vessels were, according to fragments of lore scattered throughout the game, ultimately returned to or abandoned within the Abyss itself, sent back to the source they came from. Their brief existence as individual physical beings ended, their remaining substance presumably reabsorbed into the vast, patient darkness from which they were originally shaped. There's a particular, quiet sorrow to this detail. Vessels created, briefly given form and perhaps even the beginnings of individual identity, only to be judged insufficient and returned to formlessness. It echoes, in miniature, the entire tragic logic that governs so much of Hallownest's history, being shaped for a purpose and discarded or destroyed the moment they fail to serve that purpose adequately, regardless of whatever inner life they may have briefly possessed. The Abyss, then, functions as both origin point and, for many of the kingdom's vessels, final resting place. A place of birth and a place of return, holding within its endless dark depths both the raw material of the Pale King's desperate solution and the discarded remnants of everything about that solution that didn't work out as planned. Chapter 11. The God-Seekers and the God-Home Pantheon. As Hallownest's story moves toward its final chapters, we encounter one of the more unusual and cosmically expansive threads woven throughout the game's lore. The God-Seekers and the strange dreamlike realm known as God-Home that exists somewhat apart from the physical geography of Hallownest itself. The God-Seekers represent a small, dedicated group of insects who, even as the kingdom around them descended into infection and collapse, remained fixated on a singular, almost religious pursuit: the collection and preservation of powerful beings, figures the God-Seekers regarded, with varying degrees of literal or metaphorical intent, as gods. These weren't necessarily gods in the same sense as the Radiance, a being of genuine cosmic significance and power. Rather, the God-Seekers' conception of divinity encompassed a much broader category: powerful warriors, significant bosses, and notable figures throughout Hallownest's history, whom the God-Seekers sought to capture, preserve, and eventually challenge in ritual combat within a specially constructed dream realm. This pursuit connects to Hollow Knight's broader thematic interest in dreams as a genuine, accessible dimension of reality, not merely metaphorical, but a real, traversable space that certain gifted individuals throughout the kingdom's history learned to access and manipulate. The God-Seekers, through means the game leaves characteristically vague, but which clearly involved significant dream-based magic, managed to construct or discover God-Home, a realm existing in this dream space, structured almost like a colosseum, designed specifically to host ritual challenges against the powerful figures, or gods, the God-Seekers had managed to capture and preserve there. The God-Home Pantheon, when eventually accessed by players in the game's most challenging endgame content, includes echoes and dream versions of many of the significant figures encountered throughout the rest of Hallownest's story: bosses, warriors, and notable characters from across the kingdom's history, all gathered together in this strange, dreamlike arena for the purposes of ritual combat and, in the God-Seekers' own philosophy, a kind of eternal cyclical worship through challenge and struggle. This concept adds a fascinating layer to Hollow Knight's broader exploration of what worship, divinity, and significance actually mean within this world's cosmology. The Radiance sought worship as a god of overwhelming light and consciousness. The Pale King sought a kind of reverence as a wise, civilization-building ruler. But the God-Seekers construct an entirely different model of divinity, one based not on overwhelming power or wisdom, but on struggle, challenge, and the ritual repetition of combat against beings deemed significant enough to merit preservation and eternal, cyclical confrontation. The lead figure among the God-Seekers, encountered directly within God-Home itself, reflects on this philosophy with a kind of detached, almost melancholic wisdom, suggesting that the pursuit of challenging these preserved gods represents something valuable and meaningful in itself, regardless of the wider collapse happening throughout the rest of Hallownest during the same period. There's something quietly poignant about this. A small group of insects choosing to focus their remaining energy and devotion not on solving the infection crisis consuming their kingdom, nor on fleeing to safety, but on preserving and ritually honouring the powerful figures of their world's history, through an endless cycle of dream combat. Godhome's existence also raises interesting questions about the nature of death, memory and preservation within Hollow Knight's broader cosmology. The figures preserved within this dream realm aren't simply memories or historical records. They're active, combat-capable echoes, seemingly retaining enough of their original power and personality to genuinely challenge anyone who enters Godhome seeking to test themselves against them. This suggests a world where death isn't necessarily final in any simple sense, where echoes, dreams, and preserved essences can persist and remain meaningfully active long after a being's physical existence has ended. A theme that resonates deeply with the broader story of Hallownest, a kingdom whose physical civilization has largely ended, but whose echoes, memories, and lingering consequences continue to shape everything the player experiences throughout their journey. The Godseeker's story ultimately exists somewhat apart from the central tragedy of the Pale King, the White Lady, and their vessel children, but it enriches our understanding of Hallownest as a genuinely complex civilization, one where different groups of insects, even amid catastrophic collapse, pursued wildly different responses, different philosophies, and different ways of finding meaning in a world coming apart around them. Reaching Godhome at all requires the knight to have already grown considerably in strength and understanding, which places this entire strange, dreaming Colosseum at the far edge of the kingdom's story rather than its centre, a final optional testament to how many different corners of meaning-making existed, alongside the main tragedy we've spent tonight unravelling, tucked away for only the most patient and curious travellers to ever stumble upon. Chapter 12, The Three Dreamers. Before we follow the knight into its final confrontation at the heart of the kingdom, we need to understand one more piece of the Pale King's design, a piece that reveals just how far his caution extended and just how many lives beyond his own children he was willing to bind to the fate of his containment plan. Sealing the Hollow Knight within the Black Egg Temple wasn't, in the Pale King's calculation, sufficient protection on its own. A physical seal, however imposing, could eventually be breached, worn down, or simply fail with time, the same way every other safeguard in this story eventually failed. So the Pale King devised a second, deeper layer of protection, one built not from stone and ritual, but from the willing sacrifice of three of the most powerful and trusted minds in his kingdom. These three would come to be known as the Dreamers. Each was a figure of immense significance within their own community, and each agreed, for reasons the game explores with varying degrees of clarity, to bind a portion of their own consciousness to the seal on the Black Egg Temple, entering into an endless, dreaming sleep that would reinforce the barrier keeping the Hollow Knight, and by extension the Radiance, contained. Their combined dream essence formed a kind of secondary lock, one that could only be undone if all three dreamers were found and released from their duty. The first of the dreamers was Lurian, known throughout Hallownest as the Watcher. Lurian served as a close and trusted advisor to the Pale King, stationed for much of his active life in a great tower called the Watcher's Spire, positioned high above the City of Tears in a way that let him observe the entire kingdom spread out below him. Lurian's role in Hallownest's governance seems to have been exactly what his title suggests: watching, monitoring, maintaining awareness of the kingdom's condition, even as its more visible rulers focused on grander architectural and philosophical pursuits. When the Pale King came to him with the request to become a dreamer, Lurian agreed, understanding the gravity of what he was being asked to give up. He retreated into his tower, entered his binding sleep, and has remained there ever since, his dreaming form maintaining its portion of the seal long after the kingdom he once watched over fell silent around him. The second dreamer was Monomon, called the Teacher, one of the great scholarly minds of Hallownest's golden age. Monomon presided over the kingdom's pursuit of knowledge and learning in a way that paralleled on a smaller scale the Pale King's own broader project of elevating his insect subjects toward higher consciousness and understanding. She maintained an archive of accumulated wisdom, and she trained and mentored students who would go on to carry forward the kingdom's scholarly traditions. Her decision to become a dreamer carries a particular poignancy, because unlike Lurian's more solitary watchfulness, Monomon's binding sleep meant leaving behind an active community of students and colleagues who depended on her guidance, including notably a devoted assistant whose own story we touched on briefly during the Knight's journey, and whose lingering search for meaning after his teacher's binding forms one of the more quietly moving threads scattered throughout the game's world. The third dreamer was Hera the Beast, ruler of Deepnest, whom we've already discussed at length in connection with the Spiderkin civilization and her daughter, Hornet. Hera's decision to become a dreamer is perhaps the most consequential of the three, given everything else we know about her position and her family. As ruler of an insular, independent civilization that had never fully integrated into the Pale King's central authority, Hera's willingness to bind herself to his containment project suggests a genuine alliance between Deepnest and the Central Kingdom, one significant enough that she was willing to sacrifice her own active rule and her presence in her daughter's life for the sake of reinforcing a seal on a threat that, strictly speaking, wasn't originally her kingdom's burden to bear. This sacrifice left Hornet to grow into her role as one of Hallownest's last active guardians, largely without her mother's direct guidance, a detail that adds considerable weight to Hornet's quiet, watchful presence throughout the rest of our story. Together, these three dreamers, the Watcher, the Teacher, and the Beast, represent three of the most significant non-royal figures in Hallownest's entire history, and their willing sacrifice illustrates something important about the Pale King's kingdom that goes beyond his own family's tragedy. The vessels were bred and raised specifically for sacrifice, given no meaningful choice in the matter. The dreamers, by contrast, were fully autonomous, established rulers and scholars who chose with open eyes to give up their active lives and bind themselves to a burden that wasn't originally theirs. Whether this reflects genuine loyalty to the Pale King's vision, a shared recognition of the Radiance's danger, or some combination of both, the game leaves for the listener to decide, but their choice underscores just how seriously Hallownest's most capable minds regarded the threat sealed beneath the Black Egg Temple. For the Knight's journey to reach its conclusion, all three dreamers must eventually be found, and their binding dream essence released, a process that, notably, requires releasing them from their duty rather than simply defeating them in the conventional sense. Approaching each dreamer plunges the Knight into a dream vision of that figure at the height of their power and presence, a final echo of who they were before they gave themselves over to this endless protective sleep. Overcoming these dream visions and releasing the dreamers doesn't kill them in any straightforward sense, but it does mean permanently withdrawing the protection their bound consciousness provided, weakening the seal on the Black Egg Temple in order to make the confrontation with the Hollow Knight and the Radiance possible at all. There's something quietly tragic in this too, the very act that allows the Knight to finally address the crisis consuming Hallownest requires undoing the sacrifice these three figures made specifically to prevent that crisis from ever needing to be addressed directly. It's one more example of the same grim logic that runs through nearly everything we've discussed tonight. Protection bought through sacrifice, and resolution only possible by unravelling the very safeguards sacrifice was meant to provide. Chapter 13. The Knight's Journey. We return now to the smaller vessel, the sibling set aside from the Pale King's primary containment project, the child who left Hallownest and grew up far removed from the crushing weight of destiny placed on the Hollow Knight. This is the vessel players actually guide throughout Hollow Knight's main narrative, and it's time to follow its journey from the moment it wanders back into the ruins of the kingdom of its birth. The Knight, as this vessel comes to be known throughout the game, though it never speaks and its true name, if it ever had one beyond simply vessel, is never revealed, arrives at Hallownest's outskirts with no memory of its origins, no conscious awareness of its connection to the Pale King, the White Lady, or the Hollow Knight, sealed within the Black Egg Temple at the kingdom's heart. It carries only a nail, the basic weapon and tool common to virtually every insect throughout this world, and an empty hollow shell that, unbeknownst to the Knight itself, marks it as one of the very vessels created during the Pale King's desperate project generations earlier. The Knight's journey through the ruins of Hallownest serves as the primary lens through which players, and by extension through which we've been telling this entire story tonight, come to understand everything we've discussed so far. Wandering through the abandoned, infection-ravaged remains of the Forgotten Crossroads, the weeping, largely emptied City of Tears, the isolated territories of Deepnest and Kingdom's Edge, the Knight encounters the scattered remnants of a once great civilization, piecing together its history through environmental storytelling, fragmented dialogue, and the testimonies of the relatively few surviving inhabitants still capable of coherent thought. Throughout this journey, the Knight also encounters and often forms brief, poignant connections with several notable characters whose stories add texture and emotional weight to the broader historical narrative we've been exploring. There's a cheerful, dedicated map maker who continues his cartographic work even amid the kingdom's collapse, seemingly finding purpose and stability in the simple, methodical task of documenting a dying world. There's a wandering amnesiac insect whose own quiet journey of self-discovery mirrors the Knight's own path in unexpectedly moving ways, and whose eventual fate, connected to memories of a past life spent alongside one of the kingdom's original founding scholars, adds another layer of melancholic beauty to the game's broader exploration of memory, identity, and loss. The Knight also encounters Hornet during this journey, the daughter of Hera the Beast and the Pale King himself, introduced in an earlier chapter of our story. Hornet's role throughout the Knight's journey evolves from initial antagonism, testing the Knight's resolve and capability as it enters the kingdom, into something closer to a wary, protective alliance, as the Knight proves itself capable of navigating Hallownest's dangers and, eventually, of potentially addressing the infection crisis that neither Hornet nor anyone else remaining in the kingdom has managed to solve. Beyond these named companions, the Knight's path through the kingdom is dotted with countless smaller, quieter presences that give Hallownest its lived-in, mournful texture. A gruff, wandering bug clutching a cracked mask and insisting on his own heroism despite repeated, almost comedic failure. A line of retired nail masters, once among the deadliest warriors in the kingdom, now scattered and living out simple, contemplative lives far from the battles that once defined them, willing to pass on their techniques to anyone who proves patient enough to seek them out. A small, stubbornly cheerful settlement at Dirtmouth, the surface town sitting directly above Hallownest's entrance, populated by a handful of survivors and eccentric newcomers who've made a strange kind of peace with living at the edge of a buried kingdom's grave. None of these figures are central to the main tragedy of the Pale King and his vessels, but together they paint a picture of a world that, even in ruin, still contains warmth, humour, and small, stubborn persistence. Reminders that Hallownest's story isn't only one of collapse, but also of the quiet, ordinary lives that continued, however precariously, in its margins. Deep beneath even the Black Egg Temple itself lies one final testing ground connected to the Pale King's ambitions, a place of stark white architecture and brutal, precise challenges, seemingly constructed as the ultimate proving ground for whichever vessel might eventually need to prove itself worthy of confronting the kingdom's deepest threats. This place, more than almost anywhere else in Hallownest, reveals the sheer, exacting rigour the Pale King expected from his children. A gauntlet so demanding that only the most determined and capable of vessels could ever hope to complete it, offering, for those who do, one final, wordless glimpse into the king's own private reflections on the kingdom he built and the burden he placed on those he raised to protect it. As the night progresses deeper into Hallownest, gathering strength, ability, and gradually piecing together the true history of the kingdom and its own connection to that history, the narrative builds toward confrontation with the source of everything we've discussed. The Radiance's continued corrupting influence, still seeping outward from within the Hollow Knight's failing containment at the Black Egg Temple. The Knight eventually learns, through fragments gathered across its journey, and through direct encounters with figures like the White Lady herself, hidden away in a secret sanctuary deep within the kingdom, the true nature of its own origins, its status as a vessel, its connection to the Hollow Knight as a sibling, and the crushing responsibility this connection implies. The White Lady, we learn, had long anticipated that the Hollow Knight's containment would eventually fail, and had quietly prepared this smaller, set-aside vessel as a kind of contingency, not deliberately raised for the role the way the Hollow Knight was, but potentially capable, given sufficient strength and resolve, of succeeding where its sibling ultimately failed. This revelation transforms the Knight's journey from simple exploration into something with genuine world-altering stakes. The player-guided vessel must decide, insofar as a largely silent, will-driven by player choice character can be said to decide anything, whether to confront the failing containment at the Black Egg Temple, to face both the corrupted, infection-ravaged Hollow Knight, and ultimately the Radiance herself, still seeking to fully break free from her failing prison and reassert her dominance over Hallownest and its remaining inhabitants. The game offers several different possible conclusions to this confrontation, each reflecting different choices and different levels of understanding the players accumulated throughout their journey, echoing, in its own way, the multiple ending structure common to stories exploring themes of sacrifice, transcendence, and the impossible costs of confronting forces beyond ordinary comprehension. In the most basic resolution, the Knight can enter the Black Egg Temple, confront and defeat its corrupted, suffering sibling, and take its place as the new vessel sealing the Radiance away, trading its own free existence for a repetition of the same sacrifice the Hollow Knight endured, becoming a new hollow container holding back the same ancient threat. In a more complete resolution, achieved through gathering deeper understanding of the kingdom's history and connecting with a dream nail-wielding figure at a dream realm-connected sanctuary, the Knight can potentially achieve a more complete victory, not merely replacing the Hollow Knight as container, but actually confronting and defeating the Radiance directly, freeing both itself and its suffering sibling from the endless cycle of containment and corruption that has defined this entire tragic history. And in perhaps the most thematically rich resolution, connected to that deeper communion with the void we discussed in our exploration of the Abyss, the Knight can embrace its own connection to that primordial substance, achieving a kind of transcendence that goes beyond simple containment or even simple victory, becoming something closer to an embodiment of the void's own patient, ancient nature, capable of confronting the Radiance not merely as a substitute vessel, but as something genuinely capable of ending her influence over Hallownest permanently. Whichever path the knight's journey ultimately takes, the confrontation at the Black Egg Temple represents the culmination of everything we've explored throughout tonight's story. The Pale King's desperate, morally fraught solution to an existential threat, the tragic cost borne by his children, and the small set-aside vessel who, against every expectation placed on it by its family and its kingdom, becomes the one who finally, truly, resolves the crisis that consumed everyone and everything around it. Chapter 14, Hallownest's Legacy. As our story draws toward its close, it's worth stepping back to consider what remains of Hallownest by the time the knight's journey concludes, and what this entire sprawling tragic history ultimately has to say about the themes it explores so patiently throughout every ruined hallway and forgotten chamber players wander through. By the time we reach the game's present-day setting, Hallownest exists almost entirely as ruin and memory. The grand civilization the Pale King and White Lady built together, the towering architecture of the City of Tears, the once thriving marketplaces and scholarly institutions, the intricate political relationships between the Central Kingdom and its more independent territories like Deepnest and the Mantis Lands, has collapsed into a largely empty, infection-scarred underground world, its former inhabitants either dead, driven mad by the Radiance's corrupting influence, or scattered into isolated pockets of survival scattered throughout the ruins. The Pale King himself, we learn through fragments scattered across the game's world, did not survive to see his kingdom's final collapse in any conventional sense. Some interpretations suggest he essentially faded away, his own vitality and presence diminishing as his kingdom crumbled around him. A ruler whose entire identity was so thoroughly bound to the civilization he built that he simply couldn't persist once that civilization had effectively ended. His remains, when eventually encountered by the knight late in the game's story, are found in a quiet, dust-covered throne room, a final melancholic image of a once great ruler whose ambitious solution to an impossible problem ultimately doomed everything he sought to protect. The White Lady, by contrast, persists, retreating to her hidden garden sanctuary, a space of quiet, melancholic beauty existing somewhat apart from the ruined kingdom proper, tending to what remains of her own connection to growth and life, even as everything her husband built collapsed into ruin around her. Her continued presence throughout the game offers one of the few threads of genuine hope and guidance available to the knight throughout its journey. A mother's quiet, sorrowful wisdom offered to a child she never had the chance to properly raise. The broader legacy of Hallownest, considered across everything we've explored tonight, centres on a set of themes that echo far beyond this particular kingdom's specific, insect-scaled tragedy. This is fundamentally a story about the impossible costs of trying to solve unsolvable problems through sacrifice, about a father who loved his kingdom enough to raise his own children specifically to be sacrificed for its protection, and about the inevitable, tragic flaw in any plan built on the premise that something can be made perfectly, permanently empty enough to resist corruption indefinitely. It's also, in its quieter moments, a story about memory and forgetting, about a kingdom whose true history survives only in fragments, in item descriptions, in the half-remembered testimonies of dying insects, in architecture that outlasts the civilization that built it. The knight's journey, and by extension, the journey we've taken together tonight piecing this story back together, mirrors this theme directly. Understanding requires patient excavation, requires listening carefully to fragments and connecting them into something resembling a whole, even when so much of that whole remains genuinely irreducibly uncertain. And finally, this is a story about what remains after collapse, about the small resilient pockets of life and meaning that persist even in a kingdom otherwise reduced to ruin. The God Seekers, pursuing their strange rituals in Godhome, the Mantis tribes, maintaining their traditions in isolated dignity, a dedicated mapmaker, still charting a dying world with cheerful persistence, a wandering scholar's companion, seeking peace and closure even amid fragmented memory. These small persistences don't undo the tragedy of Hallownest's collapse, but they offer something almost as valuable. Proof that meaning, purpose and connection can survive even the most catastrophic circumstances, tucked into whatever corners remain habitable once the grand structures have fallen. There's also something worth sitting with in how differently each of Hallownest's peripheral cultures met the same catastrophe. Deepness turned inward, trusting isolation over integration. The Mantis tribes turned toward discipline and ritual, holding their borders through sheer, practiced will. The God-seekers turned toward a strange private devotion of their own, choosing preservation and ritual combat over any attempt to solve the crisis directly. None of these responses saved Hallownest as a whole, but each reveals something true about how different communities face an ending they can't fully prevent, some by closing ranks, some by doubling down on tradition, some by finding meaning in something entirely apart from the crisis itself. Hallownest's collapse wasn't a single story. It was dozens of smaller stories, unfolding in parallel, each culture meeting the same encroaching silence in its own particular way. Hornet 2 embodies this continuation more than almost anyone else in this story. Unlike the Vessels, she was never created to be hollow, born from a union between two very different worlds, her mother's disciplined, insular spiderkin traditions, and her father's grand, ambitious central kingdom. She carries both legacies forward, moving through Hallownest's ruins with purpose and capability long after the golden age her father built has faded into memory. Where the Pale King's kingdom fell, where the Hollow Knight's containment failed, Hornet persists, still capable of growth, still standing among the ruins, still moving forward. Whatever ending the knight's journey ultimately reaches, whether repeating its sibling sacrifice, achieving a more complete victory over the Radiance, or embracing a deeper transformation through the void, Hallownest's story ultimately resolves not into simple triumph, but into something quieter and more complicated. A small hollow vessel, born to be forgotten, choosing to matter anyway, wandering through the ruins of a kingdom that built and then discarded it, and finding in that ruined kingdom's depths a purpose its own family never intended for it to have. That feels like a fitting note to close on tonight. Not triumph, exactly, and not simple tragedy either, but something quieter and more honest than either. The sense that even after the grandest, most ambitious civilizations fall, something small and resilient tends to remain, wandering through the ruins, finding its own way forward. There's a strange comfort in a story like this one, told at the end of a long day, right before sleep. Hallownest asks nothing of you. It doesn't need you to fix it or grieve it or even fully understand it. It only asks that you sit with it for a while, the way you might sit with an old, half-remembered photograph of a place you never actually visited, letting its quiet colours and its quiet sadness settle over you until your own thoughts start to soften and slow. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, exploring the depths of Hallownest together. If you've made it this far still awake, I hope this story has given you something to sit with as you drift off. And if you've long since fallen asleep somewhere in the middle of the Radiance's fall, or the Pale King's desperate bargain, or a daughter's quiet vigil among the ruins, that's exactly where you are meant to be. Rest well, little ghost,